Welcome to Screens of the Stone Age, the podcast where scientists review movies about prehistoric people. My name is Josh Lindell. I'm a grad student studying Neanderthal teeth, and I'm here with...
I'm Dr. Kimberly Pomp. I am a bioarchaeologist. I study the human skeleton, healthy disease, and human evolution.
And Ross is away today, but we have two special guests with us.
Hi, I'm Durga. I'm a grad student at University of Calgary, and I study medieval culture along the west coast of India.
Hi, I'm Akash, and I study stone tools of South Asia's prehistory.
And together you also host a podcast called Chippin Away, right?
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, Durga and I are co-hosts of a podcast called Chippin Away, where we look at various aspects of South Asia's archaeology, anthropology, and all things ancient. And sometimes medieval and modern too.
It's great to have you here. I'm happy that you're hosting a podcast on South Asian archaeology because today we're reviewing the movie Mohenjo-Daro from 2016. And I don't know if most people in North America are very familiar with Mohenjo-Daro because sometimes I teach that in my intro classes and seems like most students who aren't from India don't really know anything about it at all or have never heard of it. And I really wanted to do this movie because it's a crazy movie, but I don't know enough about Mohenjo-Daro to criticize its historical accuracy, so I'm happy that you're here with us to talk about it.
It is ours.
So, in case our listeners haven't seen this movie, can one of you provide a summary of it for us?
Sure. I think the story arc is pretty much like a very standard mythological tale where you have a beginning, middle, and the end. In the sense, it's a hero's journey. So we have a character whom we trace from a small village of Amri, if I'm not mistaken, and he visits Mohenjo-Daro. And when he enters the city, he realizes that the city is very familiar and that he has some kind of connection or some past that is beckoning. And through his journeys and interaction with people in the city of Mohenjo-Daro, which is a grand walled city with merchant guilds and all of the intricacies that we will discuss along the down the line, he realizes that his past is much more connected to Mohenjo-Daro than with Amri, the village that he comes from. And through that, we also get introduced to the heroine, the villain or the anti-hero, and other characters. And finally, there is a fall of the city through which this hero helps probably save the day. I don't know if that is the most accurate summary of the movie, but I tried to keep it as short as possible. And we can discuss what happens to the fall of the city and how that unfolds. But yeah, Akash, would you like to add something?
Sure, definitely. I mean, if anybody's seen any Indian or Bollywood movie, this is basically the same thing. The only thing is that it's set back in the past in a supposed Chalcolithic settlement of Mohenjo-Daro. While most people might not be familiar with Mohenjo-Daro, they would know of the Harappan civilization to which Mohenjo-Daro is supposed to belong to. Or rather belongs to. So Harappa, I suppose, at least in the movie, portrayed as the major capital, and Mohenjo-Daro is seen like this up-and-coming challenger to this title. And that also adds another layer of intrigue into the motives of the villain. I wouldn't say anti-hero because he's just a villain in the movie. And yeah, so it's basically a typical Bollywood movie, but set say about 4,000 years ago, in South Asia we would consider proto-history, not prehistory, because they had writing and literature, not literature, they had writing which we've not been able to decipher yet.
So it's a very good, succinct summary for a movie that is almost 3 hours long. There is so much that happens in this movie. Normally for our format, we start by nitpicking scientific inaccuracies. I think before we do that, it might be a good idea to just give some background on the site of Mohenjo-Daro because the movie itself it's called Mohenjo-Daro and it's set in Mohenjo-Daro and this is the backdrop. So if we're going to determine what's historically inaccurate, we should have a frame of reference for what Mohenjo-Daro actually is. And so before watching the movie, as an archaeologist, but not having ever studied South Asian archaeology, what I knew about it was a big city. It's a ruin that was rediscovered in the 1920s, I think. And it's about 4,500 years old, like you said. And it's notable for having standardized mud brick construction. The streets are laid out on a grid system, and it had a very good covered plumbing system. So I think it had running water and it had a sewer system. And so this is basically what I know about Mohenjo-Daro coming into this movie. Can you tell me anything else notable or interesting about the site?
Well, I think you covered the broad outline of a typical Harappan city. So all of them have these standardized bricks, like you said, with the 1:2:4 ratio. The construction are based in what is currently called the English bond system to ensure that the structures remain standing for longer without any weaknesses in the wall. At least these cities, a lot of them are walled. It's a Chalcolithic civilization, so which means there's an element of urbanization. So you have large cities, urban centers, at least 5 of them that we know of. One of them being Mohenjo-Daro. The others are Harappa, Dholavira, Kalibangan, and Rakigadi. So they are the 5 big cities of the civilization. I mean, if you want to consider them so, and all of them are interconnected with wide trade routes. They have their own catchment settlements that give them various resources, and this wonderful work that was done by Randall Law that shows how goods were traded all across this culture. So from, say, the northernmost bits in Afghanistan, where they're getting lapis lazuli, or in southern parts in modern day Gujarat, where they're getting stone, or in parts of the west where you have steatite, we have chert. So all of these regional raw material is processed and manufactured and sent all over this wide distribution area. So that is another aspect of this space, is that not only did they have large internal trade, but there's also evidence of trade outside with Mesopotamia, with possibly even Egypt, and some of which is alluded to in the movie. And also archaeologically we have evidence for that. So apart from that, we know that there is some evidence for incipient Neolithicization in the region. So there are sites that show how possible domestication happened of wheat, but with some contact from possibly Iran and the Middle East. So there is a local development of crops and agriculture, and that's led to this kind of civilization development. So some of the sites that they refer to in the movie, such as, say, Kodiji, Amri, these are seen as some of the precursor towns and cultures that led to the Harappan civilization. And then you have the major mature phase, or the urban phase, wherein you have these big cities, and then you have a later disintegration, all cyclical cultures and civilizations, the rise, the plateau, and then the fall. So there's a lot of controversies regarding why they collapsed, why the culture ceased to exist when, like you said, they had these large cities, well planned. They also had these 2-tier city structures. You have the citadel or the upper town and the general lower town, with a lot of the monumental architecture in the citadel spaces. So you have giant baths, like a giant bath. You have massive rooms and complexes, but no significant monumental structures, say like the pyramids or the ziggurats, which are probably contemporary. So because of this, people believe that the Harappan civilization and people were maybe not that violent, were probably more egalitarian, most probably like some kind of a democratic or a chiefdom society where power was more oligarchical. So power was not in just one person like an absolute monarch, but more equitably distributed. However, we see that in other cases that this is not the case. So when you look at burials, we find some burials that have a lot of grave goods. some burials where that's not the case. So we know that there is some hierarchization, but that's not probably seen in the city and the urban planning and the architecture.
So some of that we can see in the movie because sort of public baths, not really public baths, but like large pools sort of featured prominently in a lot of the scenes.
Yeah.
And also, like the interesting thing about the movie is that the main villain it's a political story. It's all about trade and taxes and commerce, which is pretty interesting. And it's always interesting to me to look at an archaeological movie because in popular culture, when we think about archaeology, we tend to think about the past as very magical and very different from the present. But in this movie, it's really showcasing how early our sort of basic, just like boring human lives have more or less existed in the same way. A farmer wants to go sell his indigo and then gets to town and they're trying to gouge him for taxes. And that's basically the beginning of the conflict. So with all that background, though, what can we talk about is archaeologically or historically inaccurate in this movie? I can start with one example just to show you how pedantic we are. There's not a lot that I knew how to evaluate in this movie, but one of the places I can always count on finding mistakes is in the food. There's a place where there's a sort of table laid out for a big feast, and there's a lot of pineapples on that table. But of course, pineapples are from South America.
Correct.
So there wouldn't have been any pineapples. Do you guys know this fun fact about pineapples that's been floating around, that in the 1700s, Londoners could rent pineapples for their fancy dinner parties?
Yeah, I've heard that.
I think I know that. I think in some show they put up pineapples just to be fancy, right? In some TV show.
Yeah.
Ah.
They tried growing them in London, but the climate was horrible. So there was only a small number of hothouses where they could get it hot and humid enough to get them to grow. So pineapples cost like the equivalent of something like $8,000 or $10,000 in today's money to grow. And so they would rent them out. If you wanted to have a fancy dinner party, you could rent a pineapple and put it on display and then not eat it. You'd have to return it. Just to show how fancy you are. So anyway, they couldn't have had pineapples at Mohenjo-Daro. That's historical inaccuracy. Anything else that you've noticed that may be more relevant to the actual archaeological site?
For me, I don't know about the archaeological site, but I noticed that it seemed to be very light-skinned focused, which I don't think that the actual people would have been at the time. So it's almost got that... I don't know, but you see in a lot of media nowadays, it's this focus on white skin, lighter skin. Even here in the Philippines, in the when I go to try and buy moisturizer and stuff, it's all marketed as whitening my skin.
But within the general range of, say, skin tones in South Asia, I think they represent what is currently the skin tone of most of the people in that region.
But not back in the day, though.
I mean, we don't know because until now there's only been from one sample they've been able to extract ancient DNA, and they've not been able to decipher what the skin tone of that person could be.
Interesting.
So unfortunately, preservation has made recovery of DNA very difficult from Harappan sites, and a lot of so within the Harappan burials, significant number of them tend to be secondary and tertiary burials. So already there is some post-depositional activities happening on the bones itself prior to their burial, and even in the primary burials, a lot of them, because of the kind of soil matrix that we have, are not really conducive to saving DNA. So recently people have been trying to look at parasites in the gut region of the stomach and try to get DNA from that. People are trying. Let's see, hopefully in the next few years, maybe we'll get information on how they could have looked like.
That's really cool. For our listeners, when we say primary burial, secondary burial, tertiary burial, we mean that primary burial would be where they were first deposited and buried, and then second, so they've been dug up and then moved maybe for another mortuary ritual, and then a third would be, tertiary would be third, so another movement of the body. So at that point, they've already been moved and probably disarticulated and had some kind of mortuary practice related to the skeletons and moving them. So to have tertiary burials means that there was quite a lot of movement and touching and probably losing and disarticulating of the skeleton as they moved from 1 to 2 to 3 burials.
Yes.
Actually, speaking of that, we have a long-ish scene in the movie about this, where improper burial or improper cremation is considered as a punishment when they were like left on the stake to just wither away.
I was actually thinking about using that scene in one of my classes for mortuary rituals, because our mortuary rituals and our mortuary practices are something that we don't think about. It doesn't really affect us every day unless you're working in that profession. And in a lot of societies, especially westernized societies, it's very sterile and we're very far apart from death and our mortuary rituals. But if something were to go wrong with them, I don't think we think about, we wouldn't notice it, or we don't consider that. But if you're going through the process of the loved one dies and then it were to be mishandled in the way that you're expecting it to be handled, you would have a very strong emotional reaction to that. So I don't think it often, you don't realize how important it is until you see it go wrong or in a way like that doesn't fit what you would expect in your society at that time. Yeah, it was a moving scene. But going back to the skin color, when I Googled this online, what I found too was a lot of Twitter people being quite angry about the casting of the movie.
I mean, that comes from, I think, a deeper discussion on, I mean, when it comes to regional politics within South Asia. I think we can get to that a little later. We don't have to dive into that right now, because I think we have so many other fun little things we can look at before we get into the deep dive, I would believe. So one thing is definitely the language in the beginning. I mean, even if when you go to the subtitles only start like about a few minutes into the movie. That's because in the beginning they're trying to show a possible ancient Harappan language that they were speaking, and only in between do they transition to say Hindi, which is which is an extant language that most people as a lot of people can understand. So there itself in the beginning bit, when they're using this language, there is no subtitles, so we don't know what is happening and we're just looking at it being lost. So that's an interesting take, but we don't know what they spoke. So that's an interesting thing to see. How did they come up with those sounds, those phonemes that they were using, which I think there is no basis for.
Yeah, there's we even had a guest on one of our podcasts who was hired to come up with a language for a movie, a Paleolithic language. Yeah,
for
so
Alpha.
there's people
I
who
heard
do
that.
that. I don't know how you would do that to make it sound good, but they do. It's amazing. Also with language, the writing in the background on the walls. I read too that those weren't Harappan writing, not all of them at least, right? It was mixed with hieroglyphics and other pictograph type languages.
Yes, so there's a giant wall right behind our villain in the courtroom scenes.
And in the poster, it's behind her too, right? Yeah.
Right, yeah, it is in low relief. So I think they mix Harappan characters of what we know and other symbols from other regions.
Yeah. I mean, the reason for that is we don't have a large number of tablets with a lot of text. The largest piece of continuous writing is about 13 characters. So if you have to, so if you have to get, at least for the cinematic purpose, this large slab, like something like the Code of Hammurabi, but an equivalent of that here, they needed to populate it with characters to fill in the blanks. I mean, we have about 150 characters related to the Harappan script, but most of them tend to be like conjugations of one or more character. Right. So you would have the fish, but multiple forms of fish. Then you would have, say, the circle, but multiple forms of the circle. So if you're looking at it in terms of a continuous text, it would seem very odd. So maybe that's probably why they would have incorporated text from other languages, other scripts. And I think a little bit of work went into that, wherein they tried to match common scripts, like common symbols that were found in various scripts. So say things like a straight line or a hash line or something like that, which you see in so many various other scripts. They try to use that instead of just say typical iconographic symbols like say the eye of Ankh, or like say Ankh of the eye of Ra, which is very standalone related to a culture. So I'm assuming there's some work went into that, but yeah, I mean, each and every character, I think the production design would not have probably given that much attention to after a while.
And if I can add to that, for the choice of the script and symbols in the background, they extracted some sort of selections from inscriptions that mention Harappa or muslin or something like that in, let's say, Egypt or in cuneiform in Mesopotamia or things like that, and tried to populate that on the character sheet, if I may, just to bring that out, and the cosmopolitan feel of trade interconnections and all of that.
So you think that they actually put a lot of thought into the...
I'm not sure about a lot of thought, but at least
some thought?
Yeah.
Some thought is what we're finding to be a lot of thought.
I agree.
Into movies like this.
But going back to a point that Josh raised with regards to tax, we have no idea if they had tax. We have no idea if they had a Senate. So that's something that you could give it, like the story might need that element, so they let them have it. But that's a massive leap of inference.
But I got the impression that they chose a Senate rather than a king or something else like that because of this idea that maybe they were more egalitarian than other contemporary civilizations were. So I felt like, I think in a lot of ways there's a lot that we don't know about the Harappan civilizations. So if you're going to make a movie, you just have to deal with taking some leaps like that, right?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we're nitpicking, so I just poked that out.
And if I can add to that, I think they used the model from Chola kings in South India about the guilds, the Senate, and various trade organizations and their heads, and how they represented their case to the king. So we have elaborate records in Chola India about all of that. Some are in form of copper plate inscriptions, some are on paper, I think, or birch bark.
Birch bark manuscripts.
Yes. But anyway, so I just wanted to put that little Chola reference in.
Yeah. And I think one of the major things that they brought up in the movie is about the presence of the horse.
The unicorn?
No, not the unicorn. I mean, we have the symbol of the unicorn and Harappan seals. So there is some reference to that. But the presence of the horse, we have these traders bringing in horses to Mohenjo-Daro in one of the scenes. And the horse is a major bone of contention. And I think this is where we can go deeper, because this also has historiographic significance. Because one of the reasons for the collapse of the Harappans is given to be some kind of movement, immigration, or say, for lack of a better term, this is what people in the past used to say, is an invasion of the Aryans into South Asia. And that is why the Harappans, who were considered to be Dravidian, ergo dark-skinned, were displaced and moved to the south of the country, and the fair-skinned Aryans took over the north of the country. So this is one of a previous kind of interpretation on why the Harappans collapsed. So that is why I think the color of the skin tone of the actors was an issue, because maybe people who believed that, the Harappans were the Dravidians, so they should have had their dark color tones, and they should not have been placed by light-skinned people.
Yeah, that's what I read.
But unfortunately, we have no evidence that the Harappans were Dravidians or Aryans. All we know is both Dravidians and what the Dravidian and the Indo-Aryan group of languages. They do not, as we know as archaeologists, equate to races or to people. And so that is a major issue. So that is one of the reasons why people had a color problem with the skin tone, and also with the horses. So they believe that the horses came with these Aryan invaders. So there are people who want to show the presence of the horses in Harappa to say no, that these are Aryans. And there are people who say no, the horses were not here because these are Dravidians. And then what happens if the horses are present and they become Aryans is that this becomes the homeland of the Vedic Indians. And then you can go back and push a lot of ancient Indian history of a particular leaning to much further back in time and claim an indigenous root for it. So there's a lot of politically loaded analogies and interpretations drawn from just something like, as you said, the presence of the horse or the skin tone. And I think in a way, I think they tackled it in a nice way by not trying to ruffle too many feathers and trying to stick as close to interpretation as possible by just saying that, okay, they're just actors.
That's very interesting. I had a feeling something like that was going to be the case because the reviews and the ratings for this movie online are much worse than I felt the movie was. It's getting, between like 35% on Rotten Tomatoes up to like 5.6 on IMDb. And it's not like a perfect movie, but it was very entertaining. I would have thought it would be much better than that. So I had a feeling there was something going on where, something that in the West I'm not aware of that people are taking objection to.
I mean, that's a common thing across, say, historically themed movies in South Asia.
Yes, it is politically charged with every scene, and there are a lot of meta-narratives that sort of go into analyzing the movie rather than the movie as an art form itself.
Interesting. Well, it just shows how powerful even popular media like that is for statements and society at the time that you're making the movie. Interesting.
And how important archaeology is for building narratives of cultural and national identities and things like that.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, even though archaeology has that thing, they don't really consider archaeology because we give evidence that doesn't match their narratives. So they just don't rather want us around so they can build their own narratives.
I think there is a tendency to privilege written data, like historical data, than material culture. Also because there is this sort of narrative that goes around that, an archaeologist interprets the material culture. But in historical sources, we have it in black and white. So that's where I think the push and pull really surfaces. Maybe that's why I sneakily moved to medieval.
Or you can do paleo like I do, where there is no history to interfere with your interpretations.
I mean, that's what I did. You can't go older than the lower Paleolithic in South Asia so far.
I also read online that people were upset at the main love interest, her hairstyles, that there's a lot of depictions of hairstyles from that time period and that they just didn't follow them at all.
That is actually my personal pet peeve as well. So the dresses and the hairdresses, like the costumes and headdress, we have quite a few references in plastic art, terracotta art, or even some of the sort of scribbles and lines on pottery and things like that. So that could have been a great reference point. But unfortunately, they decided to go the flamboyant way and use plastic flowers on in her headdress and things like that. So I'm personally not happy about that. And I also tried to look at some of the bird feathers that they used in her headdress. Some of the birds are not native to South Asia.
Yeah. That's what I was going to say, that they were very expensive bird feathers at the time. Then,
So they mentioned that they import parrots from Dilmun and a few other birds from different places. So I was kind of thinking that maybe it is an artistic liberty, that we can just assume that she imported the feathers from somewhere and put it in her headdress, but that's still a stretch.
Even then, it would be so heavy to wear because in the first one with the feathers and stuff, she also had like geoids or whatever, like slices of them, like around her ears and everything, like pieces of rock, and it'd be such a headache.
I think the debate goes back to use of metal in jewelry at that time. And because we have mines with geodes and some of the specimens in archaeological record, I think they decided to equate that with riches or show off money, I think.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting choice, but you're right.
Yeah.
Like, it practically
it
doesn't...
was starting to get to be too heavy of a headdress for anybody to want to wear.
I think that's most of, I think, what we think would be issues with the movie covered, unless, Durga, you have others?
No, I have like very tiny nitpicky things, such as in some of the scenes they show mirror, but they show the modern mirror, not the like shiny copper surface concave mirror, which might have been in vogue at the time. Or things like that, which are like tiny, maybe creative additions. Or even the latticed walls, with like the bricks arranged in designs so that you have small holes for ventilation or things like that, especially in the heroine or the lead actress's room when she's changing or something like that in one of the scenes. So that is not in line with what we have found with, or in cases of Harappan architecture. So that is an outlier, but maybe a creative choice just for interior decoration. I don't know. So there are these small things.
One thing I'm disappointed is that the Harappans had like proper indoor plumbing and toilets. I don't know why they didn't show these toilets.
Yeah.
That's what I was wondering too, because that's the main thing I know about Harappan civilization is the plumbing. That's the most impressive aspect to me. There was one fight scene where they broke something in the alley and some clean water was pouring out. So they did show that they had running water. But yeah, I wanted to see the sewer system. Maybe most people don't want to see that in a movie, though.
Well, it's still fun. I mean, they invented, say, the indoor outhouse, or the indoor commode. So it'll be interesting to have a throwback to that.
Although if I can be on the movie's side and say something, that in one small shot when it starts to flood, they show a tiny piece of the city where the water is coming out from the sewers and getting on the road. So probably we can take that as an indicator that it was connected to some sort of water or flowing somewhere, and yeah. But anyway, that is like 3-second or 2-second shot.
I also looked up whether there was any flooding, and it said that the city was flooded actually, I think, 5 times and rebuilt.
Yes, at least 5 times. Yeah. And rebuilt.
So it's interesting. So I appreciated how they brought that into the movie, that it was a realistic thing that would happen in that area, is the flooding of the rivers.
One of the things with the flooding is that a little bit of it, at least the damming and the flooding, is based on a 1964 hypothesis by Dales and Rakes, wherein they say that there was some kind of a natural dam that was built, that not built, but a natural dam that formed because of tectonic activities that caused the water to build up and make an inland lake that led to like about a 30-meter deposit of silt at the site. So I think there is a little creative liberty wherein they're looking at that natural dam and then made it into like an intentional dam built.
Right.
Although the location of it obviously is in 2 different places. So if it's a natural dam, it was further downstream. That's why you ended up having an inland, a filling up of the lake or making the lake. But in the movie, they put it upstream. So that's why you have the flooding. And I mean, since the 60s, work has shown that maybe this natural dam hypothesis might not actually be true. And so that again, I think that might be a creative liberty to probably try and include the flooding while also showing that the flooding, while being an act of God, was also like an act of man, which is good to try and contextualize it in the modern time with climate change and human action and agency, which is causing a lot of issues for gold and personal greed.
Well, and it made it a way so because you presume it was the villain, like the head of the city. He would have been the one that probably ordered the damming. And then he actually died in the flood because they had him tied up in the town center, and then they all fled and left him. So it was kind of adding that symmetry to the story as well, where it was like his own greed and his putting the city at risk ended up actually just killing him.
And I think that brings to a nice point, because in the last scene, they supposedly leave the Indus, which is more on the western side of the country, and reach the Ganga.
Right, yes.
So that is problematic too. This goes back into the narratives people were trying to push.
Yes.
I was going to ask about that because Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa and basically this civilization is on the border of India and Pakistan, but all these sites are in Pakistan, right?
Yes. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa in Pakistan.
Yeah. So I was going to ask if this ending where they travel to the Ganges, is this a nationalist kind of connecting the current people of India to the Indus civilization, trying to lay claim to these sites that are in Pakistan? If any of those like national political tensions play a role in this ending, or if I'm reading into it too much.
2 minutes of silence, and then so personally, I'm on board with what you just said, Josh, because I think there is an impulse to connect these two sites and sort of push for a meta-narrative that, these are the original inhabitants, and then they populated Ganga, Yamuna, Doab, and then the so-called Hindu culture flourished later. And archaeologically speaking, we have some indication that the groups moved in different parts of the country, the subcontinent, to the south, to the east, and probably some also moved to west and northwestern citadels at the time. But this selective choice has more sort of political baggage to it than just artistic choice, at least for me.
And we know contemporarily, when the Harappans were there were civilizations, and not rather civilizations, there's already cultures in all of these parts of the country. It's not like they were desolate wastelands. So if you have such large migrations, they will come in conflict with people who are already staying there. It's not like they're walking into like an empty space. And we can't also say that there was an intentional targeted migration. It's just naturally, when resources are depleting, the city cannot sustain anymore, you have a general dispersal of population. So that is what happened. Rather than, people just one day getting up, seeing, oh my God, flood, no city, and then walk all the way about a few thousand kilometers, which would take more than one person's lifetime. So I think who started the journey, if the movie wanted to be true, if the team of Mohenjo-Daro, or the citizens of Mohenjo-Daro left after the flood, in their lifetime they would not have reached the banks of the Ganga. And unfortunately, the movie shows that he's still the same age. He probably had a quick half an hour jog or cardio, and voila.
I don't think we've mentioned, but the population of Mohenjo-Daro at its peak was probably like 20 to 40,000. Is my memory correct on that?
Yeah.
Yes.
So if it had fallen because of a natural disaster like this, which I don't think is, I think we probably expect a more gradual decline like every other civilization, right?
Yes.
But if a flood had destroyed the city and the entire population had left, that's 40,000 people traveling across India. Without settling down and finding food, like you can't find food for 40,000 people on a journey. So it's not like most of them would have made that journey, right?
Correct. And the shortest path between Mohenjo-Daro and the Ganga goes through the desert, the Rajasthan desert. So it's very difficult, one. And two, even within the evidence of flooding that we have at Mohenjo-Daro, there are, if I'm not mistaken, there are no burial or no human remains associated with them, which means that probably most of them might have survived the flood, or maybe the bodies were washed away, so maybe that's why they're not in the city. But I would imagine that if it's a situation of a flash flood or something that caught people unaware, there'd be some human remains within the city, which, if I'm not mistaken, we currently don't have much information. Maybe because not a lot of it was excavated, maybe only a small portion of the site was excavated, and maybe that's why we don't have that. Or we've not done proper reference work. Whatever burials we find from Mohenjo-Daro is mostly in what is a space that is dedicated for burial practices. It's not, see, at least in Harappa, in some cases they found some human remains within the city and a wall collapsed on it and things like that. So they could associate some earthquake or some wall collapse happened and people died in that accident. So we don't have any reports of that from Mohenjo-Daro.
Right. If it was a flash flood or something, you think you'd find at least some remains in households and things like that. Yeah.
Correct. And in most of the cases, like you said, they were rebuilt. So maybe in that case, maybe they would have taken the bodies and buried them. So that's why they are not in the city. That could be another reason. So because the city was rebuilt, like you said, at least after 5 episodes of flooding in the same space and on top of the previous city. So probably in that case, maybe they might have cleared the bodies if there were any, but it's still, I mean, you would still find something.
And the practice at the time was for burial? You said
we
primary, secondary, tertiary burials?
And we also they had cremations, because we also find urns with like possible ash and stuff in it. So they had a multitude of different burial and cremation practices. So I think that throwaway line that Durga mentioned and they said in the movie, like, oh, why are they not buried or cremated? I think has a lot of weight because it shows the the diversity of the population that was living there, that had these diverse burial practices. And so even though it's a throwaway line in the movie, it is based on something that is actual, wherein there is this multiplicity of cultures and people and diversity living there.
Interesting.
Just as a side trivia, there were also different burial practices for infants and children, the urn burials. So we have a systematic record of that from the sites south of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, but we can probably connect it to the same cultural milieu. So if we were really to enumerate the practices, I think it'll be cremation, burial, and urn burial for underage children who die in infancy.
Mm-hmm. And maybe even probably like open air sky burials, wherein they were just left for like similar to how the Parsis in India currently practice. You have this space wherein you leave the body for a while, where it naturally disarticulates or probably acted upon by, say, various scavengers and carrions, natural forces, and then whatever after a few days, months, years is collected and then buried. So that practice also is possibly there, and we have evidences of, say, twin burials. So a couple burial, as they have reported from the site of Rakhi Gadi.
Yeah, there's that famous romantic couple, right? The lovebirds, the two skeletons that were found facing each other, and it looks like their arms are intertwined. That people have assumed that it's lovers.
Interpretations. Yes. Yeah.
It's sweet.
True. So which shows that there's a wide range, and whenever it comes to a wide range of burial practices, what it shows is that there's a wide range of cultures, because burial rituals is something that is very, inertia based. Like people are they don't want to change it that easily.
It's, when it does change, it's slow and it's almost imperceptible to the people living at the time, right?
Correct. Yeah. And the multiplicity of them implies that there's different groups of people.
Yeah. Interesting.
And since we are on the topic of death and burials, I think the role of water and water bodies also plays a crucial role in all of this. And including the presence of Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, which in the movie they use for
ritual.
I don't remember what they term it as, the puja,
the moon ritual.
The moon ritual or something. Yes, right. So there are hypotheses that probably that was a ritual space which was also used for other kinds of practices. Other kinds as in some of the practices that connect post-death rituals in modern India, which are performed at Ganga, Yamuna, or other sacred tanks in South Asia. So probably Great Bath was constructed for that purpose, but there is no way of knowing. But that is just a hypothesis. or it could also be a recreational swimming pool, who knows. So, but the Great Bath is one of the sort of signature public architecture at Mohenjo-Daro. So its use and sort of symbolic reference in the movie was a neat addition.
And along with the Great Bath, they're supposed to have these small little antechambers associated with them, which, while you could interpret it either as being like spaces to do secluded rituals on your own, if you want to have a ritualistic space for the Great Bath, or like simple changing rooms and stuff like that, if you want to have a more public utilitarian aspect to it. And the thing is, I think that's always a discussion we as archaeologists have now. Is it utilitarian or is it ritualistic? I mean, it can be both. I mean, everything can have an extra utilitarian aspect. So that'd be an interesting take too.
Well, and there's that old joke that if we don't know what it is, then we just say ritual.
Definitely.
On that note, we should make sure we talk about the symbol of the unicorn, because that plays a big role in this movie. So at the beginning, our main character has a dream about a unicorn, and then before he leaves for Mohenjo-Daro, his uncle gives him this seal with a unicorn on it. And so this is a real artifact, right? Unicorn seals and seals with other animals are commonly found at Harappan sites. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what did they mean, and what were they for?
We don't
have
know.
No idea.
Maybe it was a bullion token that was exchanged for something, or maybe it was a royal insignia that was used as a stamp at some point. We don't know. Although there are some seals which have the round button at the back, which indicated that it served some purpose of either being hung from the neck or maybe used to stamp on something.
Yeah. So we have evidences of, say, sealings or stamp, like negative impressions of them. So people believe they could be similar to, say, the wax thing that we use today to seal an envelope. So maybe they had, like, if it was, as they're portraying, a very trade-heavy society, these were some kinds of seals to assure, say, the quality of something, or to say this is not tampered since I touched it, like do not open or do not accept if the seal is broken, kind of a thing, or some kind of ownership marks. So it has a wide range of animals. It has most of the alphabets or letters from the script that we get is mostly from the seals. There are different types of seals. Some of them have animals, some of them have people, some of them have just text. So you have a wide variety of them. So we don't know what they could be used for. We don't know what they signify.
And again, seals are present in various material. Like there are some metal seals, some clay seals, some steatite seals. And steatite, like preparation of steatite is a long process. So somebody would go through the trouble of making steatite and fashioning it into seals. Means that seals had some kind of importance. But unfortunately, we don't know what exactly.
So in another popular series, I think The Immortals of Meluha, they're saying that these seals are representative of social classes. So for example, if you belong to the priestly class, you had one particular kind of seal. If you belong to, say, the nobility, you had a particular kind of seal. Some of it is referenced to here also, but here they say that the seals refer to which region you belong to or which family you belong to. So that's another way of interpreting it also.
And in this, they associate the unicorn to the city of Mohenjo-Daro, and they have animals for different cities of the Harappan.
So I think the 6 animals would supposedly refer to, say, the 5 big cities I said, and I'm assuming there's probably a 6th big city. Wait, let me just think. You have, what are the big cities? I forgot again. Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, Dholavira, Rakhigarhi, Kalibangan, and there should be maybe another 6th one. Who knows? Maybe future work will find a 6th one and make the movie a profit.
That would be amazing. So this must be one of the earliest depictions of a unicorn. I just Googled quickly the origin of the unicorn myth, and a lot of it says that it comes from ancient Greece, which I don't think is correct, but there was earlier ones in Mesopotamia, and then mythology of India and China. So this is probably right around the earliest, I would guess, based on what I saw. Because it says online, it says that the earliest description of it is in Greek literature for 4,000 years before Common Era. But that's just description. I don't know about depiction. It's interesting. I've never even thought to look about where does this mythology because it seems to have spread and then persist for millennia, this mythology of this horse-like creature with a one horn.
Oh, well, I think we covered that in one of our episodes in the podcast.
Oh, did you? Okay, I'll have to go listen.
So this is, at least one of the hypotheses we push forward is that in this entire region, you had rhino fossils. So you just have one horn, and it's
right.
And you're finding it along the same time with, say, long bones. So the only large kind of animal they know of is the horse. So you have the horse, and then you have this skull that has this one horn. So you would assume that it's probably a unicorn, a horse with one horn. And most of the regions where you have this myth, again, in Eurasia, you don't mostly have, until more recent times, rhinoceroses being present or known. So say if you're associating it directly with the Yamnite tribe that move with the Indo-European languages, in those regions, say sites such as Damnisi say that there used to be Pleistocene rhinoceri and horses in that region. And when they're digging and finding Neolithic levels, they're finding that some of these Neolithic pits are hitting these Pleistocene levels, and they're finding these fossils. So these kinds of, say, the dragons, the unicorns, all of these myths based on geological fossils.
Interesting. And then I wonder why it persists. Like, what is it about this horse with a horn that captured the human imagination to the extent that it's persisted for so long? I mean, we have horses. At the time, I guess they didn't have the animals with a single horn. But there's other animals that, like the giraffe and stuff, that are just way stranger, or the platypus even. And it's, why is this idea of a fairly common in a lot of areas and fairly important animal in human history, but with just the addition of a horn makes it mythical? It's interesting.
I think it will also be the length of time that people knew about that. I mean, we don't have giraffe fossils. There's no platypus in the old world. So it could not get into these mythologies. Say, if I'm not mistaken, giraffes get this. I mean, when it comes to Greek histories, where people are talking about seeing a giraffe, it is still hype. It's, that's why it's fancy, right? It's a camelopardus, a camel leopard cross. So they're trying to identify and understand what it is. So I think people came across giraffes much later in time, but they might have come across these fossils earlier. So it's probably the deeper antiquity that's made it persist over longer time spans and in larger ranges.
Right. And what are the other mystical, like there's dragons, which are from China originally, I believe, and have persisted for quite a long time. Those are culturally important for a lot of societies. And then the griffin. The phoenix.
Yeah.
I can't think of any other ones that have like really persisted into
the basilisk.
Yes, that one too.
I also think it is something to do with an animal that you already know or have domesticated, like horse, and just adding another attribute that makes it more special and hence more coveted.
And the one that nobody's seen.
Yeah. So probably it is also something about moving from unknown and embellishing it with more additional quality. And that's why it is also interesting that this movie portrays 6 animals, of which there is a rhino-like animal as well present in that. There's a unicorn, elephant, and I think a bull.
There's a bull. There's also a deer with its antlers.
And I don't remember the 6th one. Maybe a tiger-like creature.
Yeah, I think there was one of the dancers wearing a tiger skull.
They had a boar also. One of them
did they?
had the boar horns from below.
Oh, wasn't that elephant?
Oh, it could have been the elephant. No, but could have been the elephant also, yeah. I think we have to look back and see what the 6 animals were.
The scene we're describing for listeners is they're doing a dance, and all the dancers are wearing these turbans with one element of the animal sort of stuck into it. So the unicorn has a single horn coming out of the top. This boar or elephant has 2 tusks coming out the bottom. So we're trying to interpret these animals based on the one key feature that the costume designer has decided was characteristic of that animal.
And in one of the opening scenes to the city of Mohenjo-Daro, they show us a medallion with 6 animals radiating from a disc with some inscription written on it. It very well could be "Welcome to Mohenjo-Daro," but and all these 6 animals are present on the medallion.
So if you Google Mohenjo-Daro or you search for it on YouTube, after a couple of pages, eventually you're going to find Ancient Aliens talking about Mohenjo-Daro.
Those guys again.
And what Ancient Aliens wants you to think about Mohenjo-Daro is that there is archaeological evidence of a nuclear explosion, which proves that aliens fought a nuclear war over the Indus Valley civilization. What can you tell me about that?
Oh my goodness.
What are your thoughts?
Well,
I'm mind
first
blown.
I would say aliens. And then I would say remember the other series I told you about, Immortals of Meluha? So in that, in the end of the first part of the book, what happens is that these Brahmastras or divine weapons are launched from one city by a group of people from one city on another group of people from another city. And that is what is the basis for this whole alien thing. So it's literally based off fiction.
So it's based on fiction, but it's based on multiple lines of evidence converging. So if you're not a scientist or archaeologist and you're reading about this, you can read a lot of things which seem very credible.
Correct.
And so I'm always interested in, when we're as archaeologists talking about it, not just to say, oh, it's all bullshit, to actually look at the evidence that is what's being put forward as evidence and see what interpretations we can make. So there is historical precedent. There's writings about some sort of huge battle, which could be interpreted loosely if you wanted to interpret it as a nuclear war. Specifically at this site, they suggest there's evidence of extreme heat because there is melting of glass, melting of sand into glass, and fusion of some artifacts. It's always written about very vaguely, so it's going to take effort to go back to the original source, which I've done with some students in my class who've written papers, and we're like, what's the source of this source? What's the source of this source? And we get back to the beginning, we're like, oh, it's all bullshit. But they say there's evidence of heat as high as 1500 Celsius. We've talked about how there's not a lot of skeletal remains in the city, but there are some skeletal remains, and they talk about one that had 50 times greater amount of radiation than a normal skeleton would have. And I'm not sure what the source of that is or what that means. And of course, there's some evidence of destruction in the city itself, which is not really unexpected since we know it's been flooded several times and is, of course, been abandoned for 4,000 years. So, I mean, without actually having the evidence in front of you and tracing back these sources to their original, how would you interpret these several different lines of evidence if someone was putting them forward and suggesting that if you put them together, they point to a nuclear explosion?
One, we don't have any writings of large-scale battles here. That's one of the unique things about, say, the Harappan culture, is that we have no evidence of large-scale warfare. And that's also something seen in the movie, that one of the points of contention is that the villain is importing weapons, which is not supposed to be part of whatever is within the culture. So he's importing violence into the society. So the default narrative of the Harappans is that they were non-violent. I mean, it's not really that to that extreme, but we so far we don't have any evidence of large scale violence. Yes, we have some evidence of, say, interpersonal violence we see through burials and skeletons, but nothing that would, say, signify a battlefield. Like what we know from, say, Neolithic Europe. I think there's this site in Germany wherein they found along a bridge, they found a whole ton of people buried with weapons and blunt force trauma and all of that. So we have no evidence of that in any of the Harappan, within the area of the Harappan influence. And with the thing about melting and stuff like that, maybe they're just looking at slag. I mean, during the process of, refining ore, and we have, maybe it's not just in Mohenjo-Daro, that's seen in various other sites within the Harappa. They were working on tin, they were working on zinc, they were working on copper. There's some evidence of kilns. So maybe this is the slag that they're saying that, okay, this is why it is this mutated stuff. Also, in some parts of Gujarat, there is evidence of some, what are those things that you get when there's an asteroid impact? Those little molten little thingies.
Something particles or...
It's something there. Wait, I'm trying to remember that. They even dated Boise based on that to 800,000 years. So basically, when you have a meteor impact, some of the glass and the sand, it burns and petrifies and forms these little things. Wait, Libyan desert glass. I should know this. No, hallicite is a mineral. Tektites. Okay, tektites.
Tektites?
So tektites. Tektites. Okay. So there's these tektites, which is this glass that forms when you have a meteor impact. So in some parts of Gujarat, they found some tektites. We don't know when it is dated to, but they're saying that could probably be another reason why it's saying heat, explosion and stuff like that. But that could just be from a small meteorite impact and not an actual nuclear bomb.
And we have geological evidence of meteorite striking in Gujarat and Maharashtra, at least in 2 occasions, if not more.
For any listeners who want to be able to evaluate claims like this, in archaeology, we always pay attention to context. And so in this case, you have each one of these pieces of evidence, but if you put them all together, they might look like one thing. But if you look at each one in the broader context of the site, if we find evidence of, fused minerals turned into glass from heating to 1500 Celsius, do we have that focused on an epicenter where a blast would have been and then sort of decreasing outwards from there? Or do we have scattered evidence of it? Because 1500 degrees Celsius, for reference, is about the temperature that iron melts at, and 1000 degrees is about the temperature that copper melts at. And we know they were working with copper, so they could at least get to 1000 degrees easily. They weren't working with iron at this site very regularly, were they?
No, there is no iron.
But still, the difference between, if you can get up to 1000 degrees, I mean, you've got technology to get a fire very hot. You could probably get it up to 1500 degrees if you wanted to.
Correct.
So the context of where these are situated within the city really matters. What was the other thing I was going to say? Oh, the skeletons. As we've said, there are not a lot of skeletons. There are some reports that talk about skeletons that look like they, fell where they died and we found them in that position. But as you've said, overall, you don't find a lot of human remains and you don't find cemeteries or things like this. So if you had a nuclear explosion where a huge number of people died, you'd expect to find a city full of dead people, wouldn't you? So the fact that we have a small number of remains and one of them maybe is radioactive, I don't know why it's radioactive at all. But
we don't know if it is radioactive. They say
it's radioactive, right? So,
but these things were excavated.
I mean, it could even be as simply as it was carbon-14 dated and then radioactive came out somewhere.
And a lot of this area is where, say, in the 60s and 70s, both India and Pakistan did their nuclear testing. So it could just be residual radiation from that.
So that's broader context of the site in general. So when you put it all together, it doesn't actually look anything like a nuclear blast. You can cherry pick some data and put it all together and make a nice, tidy story. But you're telling me that there's no evidence of a nuclear blast.
Nope. I mean, if they could harness nuclear energy, they would have at least iron tools.
Yes.
They were still using bullock carts,
And the
and
zebra
even
bull.
copper and bronze is very limited in its distribution. While it is there, it is still, the stone is still primarily important. So that's why it's still Chalcolithic and not a proper Bronze Age culture, say in Western Europe, how with the Greeks and even the Mesopotamian Egyptians, a bronze becomes so dominant that most of your tools become made on bronze. Here it's still primarily on stone. You have some elements in copper and bronze, but they tend to be more artistic and few functional. It's not in the same quantity as say stone. I mean, if you're making nuclear energy, you would have fancy cars, you would have teleportation, you would know how to fix a tooth and dental carie and not lose your jaw to an infection.
Yes.
So what are your big picture thoughts about this movie? I haven't actually got a feel for whether or not you actually like the movie yet.
So I'm on the fence about it. I like the movie in a limited capacity that they try and showcase some of the highlights of Harappan culture. So I think they do a good job by providing a disclaimer for people like me at the beginning of the movie so that we don't go in expecting a full-fledged, archaeologically accurate picture of the time. In terms of storyline, I wasn't very invested in it because it was a very typical Bollywood sort of story arc with a lot of songs peppered in. But for those who like that genre of movies, I think it is a treat because there are a lot of songs, beautiful dances, and costumes. So overall, I came out of the movie feeling, okay, it was a fine story, but I'm not too excited about the length of the movie, which goes about 3 hours full, like 2 hours, 50 minutes or something like that.
Yeah, it
So
definitely
that
has
is where
parts
I am.
that could have been edited down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe if the storyline was more tighter and with more points of excitement or intrigue, I would have liked that. But so yeah, that's where I'm at with the movie.
I mean, if you're not considering it a period drama or a historical movie, I think the underlying narrative about how people are modifying nature for personal gain, that has a nice broad appeal. And if you can place it in the past, you can say that, as you said, we've been greedy and selfish for a long time, and goals like, say, we need to go carbon neutral by 2030 or 2050, by pushing things into the future, we're not going to do anything about it, because that's the same thing that the villain was also saying, no, just one more year we'll get enough gold, one more year, and he kept pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. So we're also just doing the same thing. Now there's already discussions of saying maybe we need to be more realistic, and because of the pandemic, say, okay, maybe not 2030, let's go for 2050. And then you have various political organizations saying, fighting against, say, green laws. So if you place it in that broader narrative about how people have always been deferring the future for their present gain, I think that it's a nice story. But if you're considering it a historical period movie, then they did okay.
So both of us are on the lukewarm scale.
I really like the aspect of it that they presented the past not in a magical way and not as something fundamentally different from today. The civilization, like, they don't have electricity, but other than that, they're fundamentally, it feels the same as ours. I mean, to some extent, they've clearly got some sort of different religious rituals that are not the same as anyone alive today, but it didn't feel that foreign no more foreign than just a Bollywood movie would normally feel to me from Canada, I liked that the main conflict was taxes and commerce. I mean, that doesn't really make that much sense for a movie. It ruined the first Star Wars prequel to have a whole plot about taxes. But it was very grounded to have such a very normal human conflict in the movie. And you know what? I've never seen a Bollywood movie before. I was worried that I was in for like tons of music. There's music in this movie, but there's only like 3 major musical numbers, and the music's really catchy. It was like, if anything, for 3 hours, it probably could have had more musical numbers to pull you through it.
I like musicals, though. I thought it was a beautiful movie, too. Like, the scenes and the costumes, even if they were inaccurate, it was beautiful, visually beautiful.
From what I read about the filmmaker is he, in the early 2000s, ended up at some film site near one of these archaeological sites and was just so impressed that he just felt like he had to make a movie. And I feel like that really comes through. It's not like there's a lot of reasons you can make a movie about an ancient world, and it seems like he just thought it was so cool, he just wanted to show it. So I feel like obviously he had to make some artistic liberties, but I mean, apart from some of the political stuff we've talked about, which I'm a little distant from because I'm not familiar with, that side of the world, I felt like he did a good job. He clearly incorporated some facts, clearly talked to some archaeologists, tried to work with what was known, and since there's so much that's unknown about it, and of course gave the disclaimer, and I think the disclaimer was genuine. I think he really just wanted to show off how cool he thought it was and didn't want to offend anybody. So I think if you're going to make an archaeology movie, that's one of the best motivations you could have to come up with a good movie. I feel like that was the case with Alpha as well,
yes.
Kim, which we've
yes. If you guys haven't watched Alpha,
Grant.
It's a really good movie.
Oh, Alpha is fun. Yes. So just to add on to what you were saying, the reason why you feel that the movie has this very realistic tinge to it is that a lot of South Asian history is still living tradition and heritage. So there are elements and aspects from the Harappan culture that is still seen in rural parts of South Asia, be it the bullock carts, be it the way the pottery is made. There's a lot of parallels and continuity. So it's not as far removed. For us, it is still living history. It's living tradition. So that's why you feel that it's realistic, because it is probably, if you take some of the aspects of that and go to parts of India, you would still see that replicated.
Is the site of Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa or these other sites, are they like commonly known amongst the general population in India? These are like points of national pride or things like that?
I'm not sure if they're points of national pride, but people have a general understanding or they know of the existence of these sites. But the fact that they are now in Pakistan and you cannot go and visit them, but you can visit other sites such as Dholavira or Lothal, which are to the south of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. There is a cultural connect between these sites, and one can visualize that it would be similar, if not totally unique in their approach. And that makes it more appealing, like even for the filmmaker when he was filming for another movie called as Lagan, which was a super hit and it was nominated for Oscars. So they were shooting that movie in the run of Kutch in Gujarat, where one of the Harappan sites was being excavated and studied at the time. And I think that was what influenced the filmmaker to take the story forward and showcase the Harappan culture. And in his super hit film, he uses taxation as one of the core points that drives his storyline. And probably that's why he used the same formula of using merchants or mercantile economy and taxation as the point of contention or conflict in his other storyline. But that's just my guess. But yeah.
Well, thanks for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. It was great.
Everybody should go check out your podcast, Chippin Away. Do you want to tell us anything about that or plug any other social media, Twitter or Facebook?
Sure. We are on Instagram and Twitter at chippinawayind, and you can send us emails at chippinawayind@gmail.com.
And we are on all leading streaming services. So it's just Chippin Away. If you don't find it, that means you're not following a leading streaming service. So change your streaming service to one that has Chippin Away.
Thank you, Josh and Kim, for having us.
Yes.
It has been a pleasure.
Thanks.
I wanted to discuss
Fascinating.
Mohenjo-Daro for quite some time now.
Yeah, we were actually planning an episode of that also. So thank you for giving us this opportunity.
And there is obviously a lot more to unpack, but we can just go down the rabbit hole as much as we like, and it would never end. So,
Just like an archaeological trench in the Indus Valley. Digging and digging. You don't reach bedrock. You just reach groundwater table.
If you've been enjoying Screens of the Stone Age, get in touch with us. Follow us on Twitter at SOTSA_podcast and on Facebook at SOTSA podcast, or send us an email to screensofthestonage@gmail.com. Screens of the Stone Age is supported by the Paleoanthropological Society of Canada. Find out more at pasc-scpa.ca.